The air hung thick, wet and putrid, smelling less of decaying cypress and more of fresh-turned earth and bile. A copper tang, heavy and insistent, clung to the back of the throat, an odor that eclipsed the sulphurous reek of the stagnant Mississippi Delta. The heat was not just heat. It was a physical weight, pressing sweat from the skin and muffling all sound into a dense underwater silence. They counted 28. 28 bodies scattered across 3 square miles of bayou that had been marked on the maps as the outer limits of the Wallace Plantation property. 28 men, members of the regulator militia, hired specialists in tracking and retrieval, men who lived by the logic of the rope and the bullet, all extinguished. The impossible number was not the 28 dead. Men died every day in the war-torn South, but the fact that they had fallen to 1. The initial report screamed of a large gang of escaped brigands, possibly organized guerrilla fighters from the Union advance, but the evidence refused the lie. There were too many bodies, too few bullet casings, and an absence of collateral damage that defied conventional warfare. This had not been a firefight. This had been a specialized, prolonged, systematic liquidation. When the sheriff's detachment arrived 3 days later, the bodies were bloated and half-eaten by the swamp things, but the pattern of violence remained grotesquely intact. 28 hardened veterans of the manhunt, equipped with expensive Henry, repeating rifles, Sharps carbines, heavy Bowie knives and trained bloodhounds, had been neutralized by a weapon that seemed to adapt to the terrain. 28 rifles against hands that, until recently, had only known the feel of rough cotton stalk and the handle of a shovel. 28 men trained in the swift, brutal science of capture against one man who had been by law and practice deemed little more than livestock. The paradox was immediate, nauseating. If this was a fight, why were the wounds so clean? Why were so many necks broken, not shot? When they turned over the corpse of Captain Elias Thorne, the leader, they found the skin of his throat deeply scored, crushed by a length of iron chain, the very chain he carried for his catch. They realized with a cold shudder that this was not a desperate escape. This was an annihilation. The location was the heart of the Delta, a territory of suffocating density where the dividing line between land and water blurred into an impossible maze. The Wallace Plantation, situated deep in the Mississippi interior in the last year of the war, was running on fear. Food was scarce, discipline was absolute, and the proximity of Union raids meant that every hand was needed and every act of defiance was met with immediate, spectacular cruelty. The system had created this environment, a pressure cooker of desperation and ownership. The man was known only as Cato by the few who dared speak his name, a name he'd been given but which now felt earned, primal. He was 30 years old, built with the dense, scarred muscle mass that decades of labor under the Louisiana sun produces, a physical presence that had always been contained, controlled. His reputation among the enslaved was of unnerving silence, a man whose eyes never met the lash, yet who never seemed to flinch. He was simply an enduring monument to suffering. The spark was not a sudden act of random cruelty, but the climax of calculated oppression. 2 weeks before the massacre, his wife, Elara, had attempted to gather scraps of cloth from the drying line after being promised extra rations. She was caught by the overseer, Silas, a man notorious for his cold sadism. Silas chose not to whip her, but to make an example. In front of the entire compound, he systematically broke her fingers, one by one, with a hammer before selling her immediately downriver. The infant son, less than a year old, was sold to a nearby farm the next morning, severed from his father forever, a disposable asset. Cato watched. The moment was not marked by a cry or a visible tremor. It was the moment the shallow, subservient breathing, the posture of forced humility, extinguished. His spine straightened microscopically. The eyes, usually downcast, became predatory. He was no longer simply absorbing the pain, he was calculating its trajectory. The first deaths were swift, efficient, and horrifyingly quiet. Overseer Silas was found later that night, not in his bed, but pinned beneath a stack of freshly sawed timber in the storehouse. The men assumed it was an accident, a prop giving way. But Silas's spine was fractured in 3 places, and the timber was meticulously balanced. The 2 drivers who had assisted in the sale of the child vanished hours later. They were found tangled in the long vines of the swamp edge, drowned not by the water, but by the vines wrapped so tightly around their necks that the cartilage had collapsed inward. Cato had used simple tools, a length of heavy, dried hickory, used previously for splitting rail fences, and his own devastating strength. He took his resources, 2 rifles, minimal powder, a leather sheath of knives, and a spool of strong wire. He did not run. He retired. He moved into the most inhospitable section of the bayou, the maze of knee-deep water and hanging Spanish moss that even the plantation owner avoided, a place he had spent years surveying in forced isolation. The Regulator militia, led by Captain Thorne, a man with a reputation stretching from Mobile to Memphis, arrived 48 hours after the escape. They were 28 strong, mounted, heavily armed, and utterly confident. "He's a darky, not a swamp fox," Thorne spat, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat, the sound of the hunting dogs straining at the leash echoing the confidence. "He's tired, hungry, and terrified. We'll bring him back in chains by dusk. 28 of us. It'll be a good exercise." This hubris was the first thing Cato dismantled. The initial pursuit was swift, the dogs easily picking up the scent trail. But the trail led immediately into thick water, then vanished. Thorne deployed 3 scouts to flank the perimeter. They never returned. The first scout, Thomas, was found 12 hours later. His death was ascribed to a fall. He had somehow tripped over a barely submerged log and impaled himself on a sharpened cypress knee that had been angled perfectly upward. The wound was deep, clean, piercing the diaphragm. Yet the area around the knee showed no sign of natural erosion or accidental placement. The ground was disturbed just enough to show that the stake had been meticulously driven and aimed. 2 more men, tracking the main trail near a narrow crossing, disappeared in quick succession. When the militia finally found them, their corpses were wedged into a deep waterhole, submerged entirely except for their feet. They had been dragged down and pinned, using the heavy weight of the waterlogged earth. Their faces were swollen, their eyes bulged with the silent terror of being held under until the lungs burst. They had struggled, but the water had silenced the screams. The men grumbled about bad luck and incompetence. The swamp was treacherous, but the pattern was forming. The swamp was not killing them by chance. The swamp was killing them by design. The confidence shattered when they found the body of the lead tracker, Jennings. Jennings was found not in the water, but hanging from a sturdy oak branch 15 feet off the ground. He was perfectly centered above a muddy trail. His clothing was ripped, but the skin was untouched. The disturbing element was his rifle. It was positioned below him, stock broken against the tree trunk. Jennings was dead, his neck snapped by an invisible wire snare. His eyes were wide open, looking directly down at a single object placed neatly in the mud beneath his feet. A rusty hoe handle, perfectly clean, resting at a peculiar, deliberate angle. It was the same handle Cato had wielded days before. It was a message. The tool that served you now waits for you. The attrition continued, now progressing from passive traps to active ambush. Cato had acquired 3 rifles from the dead, and the sound of distant single shots began to pierce the silence, always from impossible angles, always finding a weak spot. 6 men were lost in the next day, their deaths becoming progressively more personal. Thorne realized the man they hunted was a master of terrain manipulation. Cato was not moving randomly. He was using the natural features of the bayou, the shallow waterways, the thickets of palmetto, the sudden shifts in elevation as walls and corridors. He was herding them. The fear became palpable. The men stopped tracking and started huddling. "We need to pull back to the dry line, Captain," whispered Jenkins, his voice rough with lack of sleep. "He ain't running, he's waiting," Thorne snarled. "We are the regulators. We do not retreat from a piece of property." But the property began to appear, not as a solid figure, but as a shadow. A brief flicker of movement 20 yards away, always disappearing just as the rifle was raised. They saw the sheer size of him, the density of his muscle, accentuated by the moss-covered darkness. His eyes were described as empty, bearing no trace of terror or humanity, only cold, focused intent. The hunting dogs, previously aggressive and loud, began to whine, refusing to cross certain thresholds. When forced to go forward, 2 of the dogs were found dead, their throats slit with a precision that silenced their passing mid-whine. The environment turned conspiratorial. A thick rolling mist, unnatural for the midday heat, descended without warning, isolating a group of 5 militia members. When the mist lifted an hour later, they were gone. Later, their stripped bodies were found tied together, arranged in a grotesque circle, their weapons disabled. The firing pins were smashed with a rock, the powder charges carefully dumped into the mud. The cohesion of the group fractured. Accusations flew. 2 young militiamen attempted to desert, running back toward the Wallace Road. They were found minutes later, not far from the main group. Their bodies had been meticulously dismembered using a large blade. Not the quick violence of a panic attack, but the slow, methodical butchery of an instructor demonstrating anatomy. Thorne stood paralyzed near the perimeter of the killing ground, looking at the silent, arranged horror. He saw the pattern. The trails they followed led to choke points. The clearings were all kill zones. Every step they had taken since crossing the property line was anticipated. This was the terrifying realization, the pivot point. It was not a flight, it never was. It was a siege. He had transformed these 40 square miles of bayou into a Matadero Pesol, and they had walked inside the walls. By the 3rd day, only 8 men remained, including Thorne. They were beyond terror. They were static. They stopped moving altogether, grouped in a small, slightly elevated clearing, staring into the dense shadows, waiting. They had gunpowder, but no will to fire. Their rationality was destroyed. Cato abandoned the shadows. The final attacks were frontal, fast, and horrifying. He moved through the chest-high water with the speed and silence of an alligator, a primal force unleashed. The confrontations were executions. One man, firing wildly, was disarmed when Cato snapped the rifle barrel over his knee, the sound of breaking wood shocking the silence. The man was then lifted, his neck twisted with a single, massive rotational force. Another, attempting to draw his Bowie knife, found his arm shattered at the elbow by a blow from a swamp rock before the knife could clear the sheath. He was silenced with the flat side of the heavy rock, crushing the temporal bone. Thorne watched the last 3 men fall, not in a chaotic storm of panic, but with surgical efficiency. Cato was not breathing heavily. There was no discernible effort in his movements. It was the perfected skill of violence, achieved through absolute necessity. Captain Thorne was the last. He tried to draw his pistol, but Cato was already upon him. The large hand clamped over Thorne's wrist, and the sound of the bones in his forearm splintering was a wet, sickening crack. Thorne screamed, the sound instantly devoured by the humid air. He was completely disarmed, forced onto his knees in the mud. He looked up at the man who was supposed to be property, whose back was a mass of permanent, unforgiving scars. Thorne saw not a man, but the embodiment of every injustice he had ever inflicted, returning for interest. Cato stood over him, silent. Then he reached down, picked up the iron chain Thorne had dropped, the same chain intended for his capture. He wrapped it once around the captain's neck, slowly, deliberately. The final act was not rage, but performance. He pulled until the neck compressed, until the breath ceased, until the life extinguished in a soundless gurgle. the last sound being the quiet, dry click of bone grinding against bone. 3 days later, the sheriff's detachment found the scene. 28 bodies. They were positioned facing the river, awaiting the transport that was never coming. The meticulous care of the scene was what silenced the reinforcements. The wounds confirmed the story. Not one bullet wound was found on the bodies of the pursuing force. They had all been taken out silently, with leverage, blunt force, and sharpened objects taken from the swamp itself. The weapons were all there, but useless. Every piece of powder ruined, every firing mechanism incapacitated. It was the evidence of a unilateral conflict, a victory of planning over technology. The investigators, hardened veterans of frontier justice, stood mute. They had seen massacres, but never this. This required intimate knowledge, immense preparation, and a capacity for cold-blooded, detailed execution that transcended simple rage. The realization settled like the delta mud. The man had used the ground he was forced to work. The hidden deep pools, the nearly invisible quicksand, the natural growth of the cypress knees, as an arsenal. His strength was the product of decades of being treated as a machine. His resistance to pain was taught by the lash. His knowledge was simply the desperate intimacy of a prisoner with his cell. Every death was planned, every resource taken, every movement a calculated withdrawal. The resistance had not been spontaneous. It had been an inevitable strategy born from the moment his son was sold. Cato was never captured, never sighted again in the deep south by the authorities. The official records were sanitized, mentioning only a brutal confrontation with Union-backed raiders. The truth was too dangerous, too impossible to document. The search continued for weeks, but the seasoned trackers refused to go deep into the bayou. The dogs either died mysteriously, poisoned by the swamp water, or turned back, whining at the perimeter where the bodies lay. The area became haunted overnight. No bounty hunter would venture there for years. Among the enslaved communities, the whispered name of the man, the tool that broke its handle and turned on its master, spread fearfully and secretly. He became known as the Delta Demon, a ghost capable of transforming weakness into absolute, terrifying strength. The belief persisted. He had not perished. He had vanished into the chaos of the collapsing Confederacy, heading north, not for personal safety, but with a singular, terrible purpose. He had left the South, but he had taken the trauma and the skill with him. He was gone, but the men who found the scene understood one terrifying detail. He had escaped, yes, but he had left nothing behind. He took all their weapons, all their maps, and all their powder. He went north to find something much larger than personal freedom. He went to acquire the means to return. He went north not as a runaway, but as a man preparing for war. This was the opening act. The world would soon learn the purpose of the tools he acquired, the knowledge he gained, and the terrifying, disciplined silence he perfected in the swamps of Mississippi. Cato was coming back. The wet sound of the earth was the only rhythm left. Not the chirping of insects, nor the distant groan of the cypress. Just the sucking, viscous noise of boots pulling free from the deep, spoiled loam of the Mississippi Delta, a sound that had become synonymous with pursuit, panic, and finally, permanent silence. The air itself was a chemical composition of terror and decay. The metallic tang of drying blood layered over the sweet, heavy rot of the low country. Across a space estimated later by the State Marshal's team to cover approximately 7 square miles of interwoven bayou and swamp thicket, lay the dispersed remnants of the most feared slave hunting party in Hinds County. 23 men, professional trackers, hardened militiamen, and farm bosses whose names were synonymous with the whip and the chain. 23 men systematically extinguished over a period of 96 hours. This was the paradox that curdled the blood of every subsequent investigator. An army of specialized brutality, annihilated by a single man who, just days prior, had been defined legally and physically as property. Their collective arsenal, 3 dozen rifles, pistols, specialized snares, and the finest tracking dogs bred south of Memphis had been rendered useless, seized, or turned against them. They brought the apparatus of sanctioned violence, trained in the swift, brutal subjugation of the vulnerable. They found instead a geometry of death, an exacting cold calculus of elimination. When the secondary patrol found the bodies, the immediate conclusion was catastrophic error, a devastating natural disaster, or a massacre carried out by a rogue Confederate unit. But the evidence was surgical. This was not a chaotic firefight, it was an exhumation. It was the calculated emptying of 23 lives by someone who knew the anatomy of the hunt intimately, who understood the swamp not as an obstacle to be crossed, but as a weapon to be wielded. The environment itself was the first witness. This was the Delta in the late winter of 1865, humid, low, and oppressive. The cypress knees rose like silent skeletal sentinels from the stagnant coffee-colored water. The mud was thick, deep, holding on to secrets and refusing to give up tracks unless the tracks were deliberately stamped. This was the kingdom of the water moccasin and the black flies, the perfect backdrop for human atrocity, a hostile, claustrophobic expanse that swallowed sound and light. It was the geography of the cotton kingdom, where the profitability of the land required the absolute dehumanization of labor, a system that treated human life as fungible and disposable. And it was this system, brittle and desperate in the twilight of the war, that had unintentionally forged the perfect killer. The man they hunted, a fugitive referred to only in documents by the name of his owner, had been hardened by 2 decades of forced labor on the plantation's richest, most unforgiving acreage. He was introduced to the narrative only through his reputation for silence and his unnatural physical presence, a height and mass that belied the starvation rations, preserved only by the sheer, stubborn will to survive. The rupture had been sudden, devastating, and entirely anticipated by those who had watched him. The breaking point was not the whip on his own back which he had learned to endure, but the public, ritualistic sale of his youngest child, an act of calculated psychological destruction designed to ensure compliance through terror. The subsequent torture he suffered for protesting was merely the catalyst that finalized the transformation. When the overseer, a man named Garvey, turned his back for a moment of self-congratulation, believing the resistance crushed, the fugitive did not move fast, but with terrible deliberation. The long-handled splitting maul, used moments before to break timber, became the instrument of the first death. There was no shout, no warning, just the heavy, muffled crunch of bone giving way to iron, the sound of dense wood parting with the material of a man's skull. Garvey collapsed, the maul still embedded, and the silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but a vacuum, a sudden horrifying lack of all natural noise. The fugitive retrieved the man's sidearm, its weight comforting and alien, and executed the 2 remaining field bosses, one with the pistol, the other with a clean, expert slash of Garvey's own belt knife. The precision was the first clue that this was not the work of a desperate animal, but a disciplined entity. His retreat was not flight, it was a tactical withdrawal. He moved not toward the free north, but deeper into the most impenetrable part of the Delta, toward the old Choctaw hunting grounds, territory they believed he knew only through forced labor, but which he had mapped in his mind for years, inch by silent inch. Open loops, visible even in the immediate aftermath, began to define the horror. How did he manage to turn a simple piece of broken slate found in the mud into an instrument capable of cutting leather as cleanly as surgical steel? Why did Silas Kane's revered pack of bloodhound kings, dogs trained over generations to find and terrify, refuse absolutely to follow the trail past the line where the fresh water met the brackish marsh? They whimpered, their hackles raised, staring into the humid gloom as if seeing a monster, not a man. And the strange markings, crude but unmistakable, carved into the soft bark of the palmetto trees at strategic junctions. Were they warnings or deliberate, taunting signposts? Where did the knowledge of military-grade ambushes come from, possessed by a man whose entire existence was supposed to be restricted to hoe and plow? The answers were not yet clear, but the process of eradication had begun. The initial pursuing force was led by Silas Kane, a bounty hunter whose reputation for retrieving runaways alive, or mostly alive, was legendary, backed by his deputy, Sheriff Bell, a brute who specialized in psychological intimidation. They numbered 23, well-fed, heavily armed, and complacent. They spoke of the fugitive, whom they called Boy, as a costly recovery, an inconvenience solved with speed and overwhelming force. "He'll be tangled in the cane by dawn," Kane spat, adjusting his broad-brimmed hat, the morning dew clinging to the fringe. "Running property always runs straight until they hit water. We flush him out, string him up by noon." Their confidence was a heavy, suffocating perfume. They entered the bayou aggressively, the dogs pulling against the lead, their boots confident on the submerged ground. The first 3 deaths were attributed to incompetence, proof of the hunter's arrogance. Jedediah, the youngest, stumbled into a pit obscured by meticulously arranged water ferns, a pit designed not for capture, but for immediate vertical impalement. The 6-foot sharpened stake pierced his lower abdomen, pinning him to the earth. When they pulled his body out hours later, the wound was clean, the blood already thick and black. "A pure accident," Bell insisted, shouting about careless scouting. The 4th death, however, defied coincidence. It was a professional tracker named Hollis, known for his ability to read moss and shadow. He was found yards from the main trail, hanging from a thin, nearly invisible length of hemp rope, stretched taut between 2 cypress knees, his neck snapped cleanly. His rifle lay untouched in the mud beside him. The execution was too precise, the method too quiet. The environment, which they expected to be their ally, began to turn traitor. Trails they had followed for years seemed to vanish overnight. Landmarks shifted. The ambient sound of the delta, the frogs, the birds, would abruptly cease, leaving a terrifying anti-natural silence just before disaster struck. They camped on a small, dry island on the 2nd night, their spirits sinking, having recovered only dead men. When Kane woke up, he found his personal Bowie knife, a heavy German steel weapon he never let out of his sight, stuck point first into the heart of a recently killed rabbit, placed directly outside his tent flap. The knife was spotless, but the rabbit was unnervingly positioned, its ears folded back, mimicking a gesture of supplication. The implication was visceral and paralyzing. The fugitive had been close enough to reach out and touch them while they slept. He had chosen not to kill them, but to leave a message. He was not running, he was waiting. The pursuit was over, the siege had begun. 6 more men were lost over the next 24 hours, the eliminations growing progressively more intimate and psychologically devastating. The fugitive began to allow himself to be seen, not clearly, but as massive, fleeting shadows moving against the glare of the swamp, a ripple of movement faster than a man should be able to manage, a glimpse of enormous hands wrapped around a weapon. These flashes were enough to shatter the hunter's focus. The tactics shifted from passive traps to active ambush. Kane lost 2 men in 15 minutes when they split off to search a dense thicket. The fugitive used their own weapons against them. 1 man was killed by a quick, silenced shot from his own pistol, the sound muffled by being pressed directly against his ear. The other was found with his throat slit by a captured knife, placed back in his hand afterward, the victim's face frozen in a rictus of shock and utter comprehension. The environment now worked as an active accomplice. A thick, rolling mist, foreign to that hour of the day, would descend precisely when the hunting party was exposed. The rain, sudden and heavy, would fall not to refresh, but to scour the ground of all tracks, making their presence known while masking his movements entirely. The group dynamics disintegrated. Sheriff Bell openly challenged Kane's leadership, accusing him of marching them into a trap set by a Union scout, refusing to believe a runaway could possess this level of cunning. 3 men attempted to desert, fleeing back toward the supposed safety of the plantation road. They never made it out of the boundary. They were found by the remaining few, positioned side by side, their necks broken, their pockets untouched. The message was clear. There was no safe direction to run. The perimeter was sealed. Kane, now shivering despite the heat, stood over the bodies of the deserters. He finally understood. The initial escape, the route they thought they had forced him down, all of it had been deliberate. He had not run haphazardly toward the deepest, most complex terrain. He had led them there, drawing them, one slow mile after another, into a place he knew better than his own scars. The 7 square miles of suffocating cypress and stagnant water was not his escape route. It was a meticulously prepared killing ground, a private matadero, and they had walked into it, believing themselves the masters of the engagement. Only 8 men remained. Rationale had dissolved, replaced by a pure, paralyzing terror. They huddled together, static, guns pointing uselessly into the dense undergrowth, waiting for the inevitable, unable to move or sleep. They heard sounds, the shift of water, the breathing of something heavy, the scrape of metal on bark, but always too far, too close, everywhere at once. The fugitive abandoned all pretense of stealth. He stepped into the clearing just after midnight, illuminated only by the thin, sickly crescent of moon filtering through the high canopy. He was massive, silent, his body slick with mud and water, his eyes reflecting nothing. The final confrontation was not a fight. It was a series of quick, brutal executions. The first 2 men screamed, the sound muffled instantly as he was upon them. He used a length of heavy chain stripped from a logging barge. The force with which he swung it was inhuman, the sound of bone meeting metal thick and wet. 1 man tried to fire. His bullet went wide, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the scene. The speed of the killer, the precision of his movements, the complete and terrifying absence of emotion. He moved like a machine built solely for destruction. The decades of backbreaking involuntary labor having honed his frame into an instrument of unimaginable, sustained force. Silas Kane, the great hunter, was the last to fall. He watched the final 3 men collapse, his rifle uselessly empty. The fugitive approached slowly, deliberately. He did not kill Kane immediately. He disarmed him, snatching the rifle and smashing the stock against a cypress root. He took the man's heavy leather belt and tossed it into the water. Kane was reduced to a whimpering, pleading figure in the mud, forced to witness the terrifying fact of his own vulnerability. The fugitive spoke once, a voice that was low, dry, and fundamentally broken. "You hunt men," he said, the words barely audible over the sound of his own heavy breathing. It was not a question. He retrieved the chain used moments before, its links still glistening. He did not use a gun or a knife. He used the symbol of his own oppression. The chain was wrapped once, twice, around Kane's neck. There was a final, desperate gurgle, the sound of water being forced from the lungs. Then, only the tightening of the links. The executioner held the position long after the body went limp. A final, cold statement carved into the humid air. 72 hours later, a detachment of state marshals, alerted by the lack of communication, arrived at the edge of the hunting ground. What they found silenced their commander, Marshal Haynes, a veteran of countless border skirmishes and lynch mobs. The massacre was spread across the square mileage, but the final concentrated pile of bodies, the cluster of 8 men, was found on the small dry mound. Haynes counted 23 bodies. Not a single man had escaped the perimeter. The forensic evidence was damning. The initial deaths were widely spaced, suggesting calculated traps over days. The later deaths were close-quartered, implying terror and retreat into a futile, desperate huddle. The wounds were uniform, betraying a limited, improvised arsenal. blunt force trauma, clean deep cuts suggesting a specialized blade, and a complete absence of evidence of a sustained counterattack. The hunters' weapons were rendered inert, rifles found submerged, their powder spoiled, pistols deliberately disassembled. The one weapon missing was the chain. The investigators quickly pieced together the brutal efficiency. The fugitive had used his intimate knowledge of the land, gained from years of being forced to clear and traverse it, turning every shadow into a firing position, every patch of stagnant water into a defensive moat. His strength, initially dismissed as mere size, was the honed, explosive power of a man whose body had been pushed past the limits of human endurance by decades of systematic brutality. It was not chaos. It was methodology. The investigators found small caches of provisions, parched jerky, wrapped in oilskin, and sharpened sticks hidden within hollow logs, evidence that the fugitive had prepared this escape route and this killing ground long before the injustice forced his hand. The initial escape was merely the trigger. The extermination was the plan. The fugitive, the man who erased the Kane party, was never captured. The pursuit was called off within a week. The subsequent tracker teams, hired at astronomical cost, returned empty, defeated not by evasion, but by pure refusal. The dogs would not cross the invisible line. The men spoke of a silence that was too heavy, a dread that was too physical. The area was immediately avoided. It became known regionally in hushed tones as the killing ground. The official records were sanitized, blaming Union guerrillas for the massacre, a convenient lie for the Confederacy to swallow in 1865. But the truth was carried on the wind and whispered through the slave quarters. They gave him a name spoken only in the deepest darkness: the Cypress Demon. A man who proved that the human capacity for endurance, when finally broken by unforgivable cruelty, could turn backward and consume its tormentors whole. This ghost, this terrifying engine of resistance, did not die in the swamp. He utilized the escape route he had carved out in blood, reaching the Union lines not as a refugee seeking freedom, but as a hardened, tactical survivor seeking a weaponized return. The annihilation of the 23 hunters was the terrible, necessary preparation for the 400 soldiers he would eventually lead back to Mississippi. He was no longer property. He was a weapon seeking vengeance. If you seek more stories that the official history attempted to bury, moments where the considered property transformed into the nightmares of their jailers, where the resistance was not noble but absolute and terrifying, subscribe and follow the trail of the bodies. The Mississippi Delta did not forgive incompetence. It was a hostile entity built of heat, stagnant water, and deep, choking mud that consumed sound and light. The pursuing party, now reduced to 12 men, not counting the 2 who had simply walked north in the night, choosing potential capture over the certain death they felt closing in, moved not with the confidence of hunters, but with the paralysis of bait. Their initial arrogance, bolstered by decades of unchallenged dominance over the enslaved population, had been systematically eroded by the first wave of brutal, calculated eliminations. Captain Hollis, his white linen jacket now stained dark with swamp water and dried blood, wiped sweat from eyes that betrayed a lack of sleep and too much fear. The terrain itself was becoming a lie. Trails that had been cleared yesterday were now blocked by fresh falls of cypress limbs. Familiar waterways seemed to have shifted their course, leading them in bewildering circles, always bringing them back to the point of a previous discovery, the silently dispatched body of a comrade. The transition from Wave 1, accident-attributed deaths, to Wave 2, active terror, was marked by a shift in the nature of the encounters. The fugitive was no longer just laying traps, he was orchestrating movement. Silas, a large, thick-necked overseer, known for his use of the bullwhip, had disappeared 3 days prior while scouting ahead. They found him half submerged in a bayou tributary, not drowned, but held down. The rope, A simple hemp hawser stolen from a supply barge was cinched around his throat and tied to the sunken root structure of a mammoth cypress tree. But the terror was not the drowning. It was the meticulous damage inflicted before death. Silas's chest had been flayed, not with a blade, but with a dull, heavy object, stripping away the skin in strips wide enough to reveal the white curve of his ribs. Beside him, driven deep into the mud, was a broken shovel handle, sharpened to a devastating point. The kind of tool Silas had habitually used to beat field hands into submission. It was a message transcribed in flesh. Your own tools will unmake you. The psychological erosion accelerated. They stopped speaking the fugitive's name. They referred to him only as it or the shadow. Their fear was amplified by the realization that they were being studied. They would find signs that their campfires had been watched from only yards away. Cigarette butts, still damp from the recent rain, would be found near their perimeter, proof of an impossible proximity. Every decision they made, every whispered argument, every moment of rest, felt rehearsed for the benefit of an unseen audience. The pursuit morphed into a desperate retreat, but even retreat was impossible because the exit routes were now compromised. The remaining men started turning on each other. Miller, the youngest, claimed he saw the fugitive, not running, but walking backward into the thicket, inviting them deeper. Hollis slapped him, but the certainty in Miller's eyes, the certainty of absolute dread, was more contagious than any disease. 2 nights later, Miller bolted, running wildly toward the north, screaming about the smell of burnt flesh. They found his tracks for a short distance before they vanished completely, as if the swamp had simply opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. The fugitive began to use their own resources against them. 3 more men were felled when they stopped to drink from a small, clear pool. The water, clean at a glance, was laced with belladonna, meticulously brewed from local plants, a lethal knowledge possessed only by those who had worked the land for generations and knew its quiet toxins. They died convulsing, their faces dark and swollen, clutching their guts as Hollis and the others looked on, unable to help. The great Patton Interrupt too arrived, shattering the last semblance of military order. They reached the clearing known as the Hog Pen, a small dry rise that Hollis had used years ago for slave auctions. It was here they discovered the true, devastating geometry of the situation. It wasn't merely that the fugitive had escaped, it was that he had never left. Dug into the dry earth, concealed beneath layers of palmetto fronds, was a depot. Not just a temporary hiding spot, but a fully stocked cache. Dried, smoked meat, large gourds filled with clean water, salvaged Union Army blankets, proof of contact far beyond the Delta borders, and most disturbingly, a small forge set up near a cluster of ancient, fire-blackened stones. It was the inventory of the forge that crushed them. Here were dozens of metal implements, hooks fashioned from wagon axles, razor-sharp blades hammered out of plowshares, and long, thin spikes meticulously filed down from railroad ties, all weapons designed for silent, efficient killing. This was not the desperate flight of a runaway. This was the headquarters of a meticulous operation. Hollis picked up a single object, resting on a bed of dry moss. A leather-bound notebook filled with meticulously drawn maps of the immediate area. Not just basic terrain, but detailed schematics showing water depth, hidden quicksand locations, old deer trails that no white man remembered, and most horrifically, X's marking the precise locations of the bodies of the first 9 men they had lost. Underneath the map, written in precise, educated script, a skill Hollis was certain no man he had ever owned possessed, was a single phrase: 40 miles square. The perimeter is closed. The revelation struck them with the force of physical trauma. They had entered voluntarily into a complex, engineered execution chamber. The 4 remaining days of pursuit had not been hunting the fugitive. They had been walking the pre-planned route of their own slaughter. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty. This was not escape. It had never been. It was a siege. He had transformed 40 square miles of the Mississippi Delta into a personal abattoir, and they had entered voluntarily. But in Wave 3, annihilation systematic, the group disintegrated immediately. Two men, Preacher and Cobb, threw down their rifles and ran in opposite directions, convinced that staying together was only prolonging the inevitable. They hadn't gone 50 yards before the silence was punctuated by two muffled, wet impacts. Hollis and his remaining second-in-command, Jenkins, the most veteran, most hardened slave catcher, huddled back to back, the sweat freezing on their necks despite the oppressive humidity. They were static, paralyzed by the knowledge that every move, every breath was known and calculated. They didn't even try to track Preacher and Cobb. They simply waited for the third sound, the sound they knew would be for them. The fugitive abandoned the disguise of the shadow. He moved into the clearing with unnerving speed, materializing from the dense foliage not as a ghost, but as a physical force too large and too fast to be human. The air around him seemed to thin, pulling the oxygen from their lungs. He was massive, built not of fat but of ropey muscle hardened by decades of forced labor, a living monument to the impossible strength extracted by the plantation system. His face was a landscape of old scar tissue, utterly devoid of emotion. His eyes were not angry or seeking vengeance. They were simply vacant, the eyes of an executioner carrying out a necessary duty. He held a machete, dull with earth and stained with the darkness of pooled blood. It was the tool of the cane fields, now weaponized. Jenkins raised his rifle, a heavy muzzle loader, but the sheer speed of the fugitive's approach overwhelmed him. Before he could pull the hammer back, the fugitive was on him. There was no struggle, no shout of pain, only the sickening sound of heavy metal striking bone. The fugitive did not stab, he struck. The machete came down, splitting the rifle stock lengthwise and sinking deep into Jenkins' collarbone. A clean, devastating blow that extinguished life instantly, extinguishing the sound of his last breath before it could fully form. Jenkins collapsed, a weight of flesh and broken wood, silent. Captain Hollis was left alone. He looked down at Jenkins, then up at the fugitive, who stood over him, breathing heavily but steadily, a rhythmic sound that seemed deafening in the swamp. Hollis, who had overseen the branding and torture of hundreds, felt a paralyzing coldness that was deeper than fear. It was pure, absolute vulnerability. The fugitive did not immediately kill him. He took the few steps necessary to stand directly in front of Hollis, who dropped his own useless rifle into the mud. The fugitive raised the machete, but then stopped. He tilted his head slightly, a movement of curiosity rather than sadism. He moved his hand, reaching into the deep pocket of his canvas coat, and pulled out a worn, heavy leather whip. It was Hollis's whip. The very whip that had left the long, crisscrossing scars on the fugitive's back years ago. The scars that had created the physical endurance necessary for this night. Hollis stared at the instrument of his authority, now held by the consequence of his actions. The fugitive, whose voice had not been heard by any of these men for years, finally spoke. His voice was a dry rasp, lower than the deepest roots of the cypress. "You called it property." It was not a plea, not an accusation. It was the closing statement of a judicial process. He threw the whip to the ground. Then, with the machete, the fugitive moved with a devastating final precision. He did not stab. He used the flat of the blade to shatter Hollis's right hand, the hand that held the deeds, that held the whip, that signed the arrest warrants. The sound was the loud, wet crunch of small, delicate bones collapsing. Hollis screamed, a sound choked off instantly as the fugitive used the handle of the machete to strike him violently across the jaw. Hollis fell, spitting blood and teeth into the black mud. He was finished, defeated, disarmed, utterly broken. The fugitive did not hesitate further. He grabbed the chain that Jenkins had been carrying, the heavy neck-locking chain intended for the capture, and looped it once around Hollis's neck. He did not pull. He knelt, took the other end of the chain, and with the immense, practiced strength of someone who had moved earth and stone for decades, he simply twisted, turning the metal links into a vice. The crushing of the windpipe was a sound swallowed by the deep, pervasive silence of the delta. Captain Hollis, the proud architect of oppression, was extinguished by the very symbol of his ownership, made small, insignificant, and mute in the soil he believed he commanded. The fugitive stood. He looked down at the bodies. 14 men, killed systematically over 7 days and 40 miles, culminating in this final, brutal tableau. He surveyed the clearing, his chest rising and falling evenly. Then he dropped the bloody machete into the mud, turned his back on the carnage, and melted into the dense green of the swamp, leaving the silent, wet graveyard to its own devices. He was heading north, following the prearranged routes he had meticulously mapped, toward the distant promise of freedom and the massive disciplined force he had sworn to bring back. The last sound heard in the clearing was the slow, rhythmic drip of blood onto the mossy earth, followed by the heavy, oppressive silence of a jurisdiction perfectly cleared. The smoke hung thick and low over the remains of the Thornwood plantation, not the black, sooty column of an uncontrolled blaze, but a pale, choking haze of damp wood and human fat. It was August in the Mississippi Delta, 1865, and the heat was a wet, living thing that pressed down on the lungs, making every breath a chore, tasting of copper and ash. 26 hours had passed since the last organized resistance had collapsed. The silence now was heavier than the artillery barrage had been, a profound, unholy absence of sound where once had been the cacophony of wealth, fear, and now extermination. 42 bodies precisely. That was the count the advance scouts delivered back to the main Union column, arriving days later. 42 men, planters, militia members, overseers, who had chosen to barricade themselves in the manor house and the reinforced cotton barn. They had boasted of superior arms, of God-given authority, and of the impenetrable nature of their white sovereignty. The paradox was etched into the scorched earth. Here were the ruins of the power structure, systematically dismantled, brick by brutal brick. They had been 28 rifles against 400 disciplined, rage-fueled bayonets. It had not been a fair fight, but the term fight suggested parity. This had been an agricultural process, a harvest of long overdue debt. Captain Silas Vance, detached from the 10th Illinois Cavalry, was the first Union officer permitted to survey the aftermath. He had seen battlefields, Antietam, Vicksburg, sites of necessary carnage. Thornwood was different. Thornwood felt intentional, a theatrical production staged specifically for the benefit of the dead. The grounds were meticulously searched. They found the bodies grouped in 3 distinct areas. The first group, a dozen militiamen, lay sprawled near the collapsed gatehouse, victims of converging rifle fire and what appeared to be explosive charges strategically placed beneath the foundation walls. Their uniforms were shredded, the wounds clean and efficient. These were military deaths. The second group, found near the smokehouse, showed signs of a brief, desperate melee. These men had attempted to break the siege line, presumably aiming for the bayou. They had been cut down by organized pincer movements, their heads crushed, their bodies pierced by bayonets. Vance noted the specific angle of the bayonet thrusts, low, quick, designed not merely to kill, but to disable immediately and definitively. This showed training honed not in parade grounds, but in the gruesome efficiency of frontline combat. But it was the third group, inside the main manor house, or what remained of it, that shattered Vance's already frayed nerves. The house had not simply burned, it had been shelled and breached. The final stand had taken place in the library, a space meant for quiet contemplation, now soaked floor to ceiling in blood and splintered mahogany. Here lay the core of the local power structure. Judge Amos Thorne, the plantation owner and head of the local slave patrol, alongside his 2 sons and several prominent neighbors. They had been killed, After the resistance ceased, their firearms, Kentucky rifles and ornate dueling pistols, lay stacked neatly on a corner table, unloaded. Vance knelt beside Thorne's corpse, the air stifling. Thorne had not been shot. He had been beaten systematically, every bone in his hands broken before the final act. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling that was no longer there. His chest bore 2 specific wounds, not penetrative, but crushing. It looked as if a heavy, blunt instrument, perhaps a sledgehammer or the butt of a heavy rifle, had been used with cold, deliberated power. But the instrument of death was not what shocked Captain Vance. It was the method. Protruding from Thorne's mouth, clamped between his jaw, was a small 3-pronged whipping lash, the very same type used on the fields to enforce compliance. It was a mute, horrifying signature. This wasn't chaos, Vance muttered to his sergeant, his voice thin. This was ceremony. The USCT forces, led by Elijah, had not just sought victory, they had sought narrative closure. They were not common raiders. They were architects of retribution. As Vance surveyed the grounds, the open loops began to snap shut, revealing the meticulous preparation. The capacity of the USCT to breach the manor's brick defenses, an impossibility for disorganized raiders, was explained by the engineering precision. Elijah, who had grown up on this land, knew the water runoff patterns, the weak points in the foundations, and the fastest routes through the drainage ditches. The USCT utilized sappers, men trained to dig under walls, placing charges exactly where the thickest load-bearing structure met the soft delta soil. How had Elijah, the fugitive, possessed this knowledge? Decades of forced labor had turned him into an intimate cartographer of the plantation. He had mapped its weaknesses while laying its foundations. The escape to the north and the subsequent enlistment had not provided him training from scratch, but rather the organized military structure to weaponize knowledge he already possessed. The mystery of the unit's discipline and the absence of collateral damage, no stray shots, no random destruction, was also solved. This was not the standard mayhem of post-war pillaging. This was surgical. Every man killed was a participant in the local system of oppression. The few house slaves and field hands who had remained were found unharmed, gathered quietly in the old church, now under the silent protection of the USCT perimeter. Vance found the command center in the slave quarters, untouched by the fire, but completely cleaned out. On a rotting table, the only object left behind was a small stack of papers. The deeds to the plantation, the bills of sale for every human being owned by the Thorne family, and the records of punishment. All were neatly pierced through the center by a single, rusty bayonet, anchoring them to the wood. A final message, devoid of words. The paperwork of ownership was invalidated by iron. The USCT, the 327th Regiment, had completed its mission and dissolved into the landscape as silently as they had arrived. When Captain Vance finally submitted his report detailing the systematic nature of the annihilation, the response from Union Command was swift and predictable: denial. The official record could not tolerate the truth that 400 black soldiers, led by a former slave, had executed a localized, organized act of vengeance against the planter class in 1865. To acknowledge the truth was to acknowledge the complete collapse of racial order and the terrifying possibility of future insurrections led by trained veterans. The narrative was immediately crafted. The Thornwood incident was blamed on unidentified bushwhackers or disorganized elements of Confederate deserters who had turned to banditry. The fact that the attackers had used federal issue rifles and drilled tactics was conveniently ignored. The bodies of the planters were hastily buried. The evidence, the bayoneted deeds, the ritualistic killing of Thorne, was suppressed. But the truth, like the iron tang of blood, permeated the humid air of the Delta. Elijah was never seen again by any official authority. He was not listed as a deserter. He was simply absent from the unit roster 2 weeks later when the 327th officially mustered out of service further north. The theories of his fate became immediate regional myths. Some claimed he had led his men across the Mexican border, forming a community of free soldiers who fought in the border wars. Others whispered that he had stayed in the Delta, dissolving his identity among the thousands of newly freed people, becoming a phantom protector, a shadow that watched from the cypress groves. The legend that took root, however, was far more potent than the man himself. They called him the Delta Shadow. His name became a silent warning whispered across the new, fragile society of the post-war South. If a local landowner began to enforce the old, oppressive codes, if the whips reappeared, if the chain gangs were too brutal, if a black man was murdered without consequence, a certain dread settled. They remembered Thornwood. They remembered the perfect, terrifying silence after the shelling. For decades, slave patrols and the nascent Ku Klux Klan groups would refuse to venture too deep into that specific 40-mile square of the Delta surrounding the Thornwood ruins. The place was considered cursed, the soil too thirsty for white blood. The dogs, even the most aggressive bloodhounds, would whimper and refuse to track if led too close to the remnants of the manor house, just as they had during the siege, sensing the shift from natural fear to systematic, organized terror. The impact was systemic, though unacknowledged. The brutality of the Southern ruling class, while intensified by Reconstruction, had gained a new, nervous edge. They knew that the power they had built upon the backs of others could, and had, been used as a lever to destroy them entirely. The USCT had shown that resistance wasn't just a flight to freedom. It could be a controlled, surgical strike designed to sever the head of the system. Elijah, the slave who came back with 400 soldiers, left behind a legacy that transcended abolition. He left behind the proof of capacity, the knowledge that those deemed property had not only the will, but the acquired military expertise to execute the absolute annihilation of their tormentors. His story, cleansed and suppressed in official state archives, lived on only in the dense humidity of the Delta, transmitted orally, a chilling tale of reversal and finality, a symbol of resistance that was not noble, but absolute and terrifying. If you seek more stories that the official history tried to bury, moments where the considered property transformed into the nightmares of their oppressors, where the resistance was not a plea for mercy, but a calculated execution of justice, know that the silence of the Delta still holds the final screams of those who refused to believe the enslaved could ever return as soldiers.